Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for logging in to week 7 of our Retail Leasing Weekly Health Checks. With us again today, as always, is Kyle Swain from Lpc Cresa. So, Kyle, you have a lot to get through today, so please take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Beck, and thanks everyone for joining. I do have a lot to get through. We've got some extra slides this week, and I want to get through that as quickly as possible, and again open it up for question and answers because that's been very popular and very helpful for a lot of people. So let's move to the next slide, Beck. Obviously, as we've said every week, the whole thing is just changing on a daily basis, and that's been the case in the last week. Some good stuff come out last week regarding the easing of restrictions, and that's, of course, changed the landscape for conversations with landlords through the pandemic period, and starting to focus on the period after that. There's even talk of ceasing the JobKeeper payments. So it's a changing landscape. We're going to have a look at what the main talking points are. Let's pop to the next slide, Beck. If we go back one, just because that's an interesting surviving in the post-COVID period. This is a restaurant in Amsterdam that has created these little pods so people can safely dine at their restaurant and utilise the service and still safe distance from each other. On to the next one, Beck. So what we're looking at today is the compelling picture that you have to paint for your landlord if your business is going to survive through a pandemic period and then thrive post-COVID-19. We need to paint a compelling picture and get your landlord on side with you so that they're a retail partner, a key stakeholder, and not an adversary through the whole process. So we're going to look at probably the top 3 points I see as the talking points that you need to focus on with discussions with the landlord from this point forward. Point 1, Beck. What's in it for them? As indicated, we need for them to see themselves as a key stakeholder in your business, as your retail partner, and not the traditional landlord-tenant relationship. And particularly in the last 5 years or last lease cycle or 2, there's certainly been an adversarial relationship between tenants and landlords in Australia and elsewhere. So we need to really work on the discussions with landlords around the shared responsibility, getting through this together, working together, and so on. So what will motivate the lessor to provide more support than the minimum requirement? And again, we're really seeing landlords coming to the table almost begrudgingly meeting their minimum obligations under the mandatory code of conduct, and in some cases, unfortunately, looking for ways not to be obligated to meet those minimum obligations. What we're talking about with landlords here is the concept of continuity of business for the full lease cycle, and not just this 3 or 6 month period that the JobKeeper is in place for. We really need to be talking now about the period after JobKeeper cuts out, after the mandatory component of the proportional rent relief cuts out, what's required by your business at that time, and what's in it for them to be involved in that. The risk to the lessor, if they only provide the minimum relief, has to be a part of that discussion. You have to be able to clearly articulate what that risk is to them. Obviously, if you're not there, we've talked about the last couple of weeks, the economic situation and so on. The market conditions won't be favourable for landlords. You need to be able to paint that picture that the risk to them is having an empty tenancy if you're not there, if you aren't thriving post-COVID, if you have deferred rent that increases the burden on you paying rent in very challenging retail times and your business is under financial distress because of that minimum obligation and the deferred rent component, then the risk to the landlord is that he doesn't have a tenant paying rent through the lease cycle. And in those extremely challenging economic conditions that we're expecting, that could prove a very difficult situation for the landlord to fill the tenancy at the sort of rent that they're currently achieving from you, and without incentives and other costs in order to replace you, such as marketing costs, legal costs, make good and fit out costs, incentives, and so on. So that's the first one. What's in it for them? You need to be able to explain to them how beneficial it is for them to work with you during this period. Next one, Beck, number 2. Clearly defining the reasonable recovery period is a key component here. In the mandatory code of conduct, obviously it's mentioned. It's indicated that there's an expectation that the landlord provide ongoing assistance during that reasonable recovery period, but it's certainly not defined in the code by a time frame nor any prescriptiveness around the proportionality or what form it even is offered in. So you have to paint that picture for the landlord on your specific circumstances. And this reasonable recovery period is very different for different businesses, of course. As an example, I have a client who 70 to 90% of their business is focused on international tourism. And they're in places like an airport DFO or Fremantle in Perth or Birkenhead Point outlet in Sydney, places where it's very much tourist focused, and their product is very much tourist focused. For them, with international travel being deeply affected, that recovery period is very long, very deep, and very challenging for them. Whereas for some other businesses, it can be impacted by the changing conditions, economic conditions and consumer behaviour, but it would be expected to return possibly almost fully to a degree in 3 or no more than 6 months. So you have to forecast the conditions, the impact on your business specifically, and have that conversation with the landlord. And that conversation should be around KPIs or performance indicators rather than a time frame. There's no point saying for 3 months if in that time your turnover hasn't returned to full. So the KPIs are things like turnover returning to pre-COVID turnover, monthly turnover, profitability, transaction numbers, so measurable performance indicators like that. And an example that I give is when turnover returns to at least 95% of pre-COVID period turnover for at least 2 months in a row, then we would accept that the recovery period could be considered over that at that point. And be very clear on what assistance you're seeking during that time, whether it's turnover based or percentage rent based, for example. If it's just straight a percent of your rent being deducted, that's one way of doing it. Another way, when you're proposing this a couple of months in advance, we've been talking with landlords for our clients based on turnover as a percentage of their total turnover rent as a percent of total. So clearly define that recovery period. Have it clear in the landlord's mind that they need to provide assistance for a certain period to assist your business to get back to pre-COVID conditions, how long that's likely to take based on particular data relevant to your business, and get buy-in on that. And then there's the third key point to communicating with the landlord around this period. They need you as much as you need them. They have to believe that. Certainly in the past, it's been the relationship's been heavily biased in the landlord's favour. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of articles around landlord churn. The CEO of Centre Group was quoted about having a process of curation in their centres where they were essentially happy to churn clients who couldn't afford rent or ask for abatements because they believe their customers like to come in and see new tenants all the time anyway. I think that that is changing, certainly with COVID and the impact of that, the changing economic conditions, that power bias to the landlord is certainly changing, and you need to be able to communicate that to the landlord in the right way. You need to be able to talk about the economic factors that has serious implications for landlords over the next lease cycle. We've talked about that a little bit last week and the week before. Some of the economic factors. Now, the RBA came out last week, left interest rates on hold. They really don't have a lot of room to play with interest rates to try to generate activity and improve inflation. But they tried to talk quite positively and talked about a V-shaped recovery. You may recall I talked about an L-shaped recovery last week, and I hold firm on that. The RBA has certainly presented a very positive picture the last couple of years and really hasn't delivered on that. They're doing that again now, as you would expect, wanting confidence in the market. But the fact is all indicators are to an L-shaped recovery. The landlord needs to understand that. They can't afford to churn new tenants and look for new ones to replace you. That will be harder and harder for them to do, and they need to get a grip of that, understand it, and take that on board. There's also this discussion around whether there's a vaccine or not a vaccine and what impact that has. At the moment, there's no vaccine. At the earliest, there's some indication that something may be available later this year, but that not having a vaccine has a massive impact on that recovery and the L shape because social distancing remains in place while there's no vaccine. So business will be limited to numbers. If you've been in a shopping centre in the last week or so, you'll see what impact that has on retail stores with very limited customers in their stores and so on. A lot of lining up. I did that the day before Mother's Day to try to pick up a quick present and in and out, and it was quite a horrible experience that I do not want to go back to a shopping centre as much as I want to support retailers. It's just not a fun experience, it's not a pleasant experience, and just pushes people to online retail and other avenues. So while social distancing remains and that impacts on the retail experience, it's going to impact on retailers' turnover. And the final point under this that I make is the more pain they take now, the less pain they'll take over later on or over the lease cycle. If they're trying to save money now by deferring rent rather than waiving rent to protect their income for the financial year, then that causes businesses to fail in 6-12 months' time, and their financial performance will certainly be impacted in the next financial year deeper and longer for all the reasons we've talked about. That's a very, very quick overview of the three key talking points that you need to convey. If you can keep those in mind and formulate your own discussion, that's the probably the expertise that tenant reps bring to these conversations to be able to communicate those points in order to get landlord support for you, not just to provide rent relief under the mandatory code, but to provide more than the minimum requirement. And certainly to provide more in waived rent rather than deferred rent. The next slide, Beck, if we move on. We're on Q&A time now, and while you're tapping away asking your questions for Rebecca to put to me, I've done a personal indulgence this week while you're doing your question and answers. There's a little photo there. This Saturday, I would have been doing a charity ride for motor neuron disease. Unfortunately, I have a brother with motor neuron disease, and supporting the MND and Me Foundation here in Queensland. Their major charity ride, which would have raised about $100,000, was on this weekend, and that's obviously been postponed indefinitely because of the coronavirus. So I have joined in their MN Distance Challenge online, and decided that I would sit on my home trainer and Zwift for 8 or 9 hours riding on Zwift. I'll cover 215 kilometres and about 3,500 metres of climbing on Saturday for a bit of fun. And if you happen to want to support that charity, you can go to that address there, find the MND and Me Foundation page, and have a think of MND and of me on Saturday, spending my day on the bike. Have you got some questions now, Beck?
Utterly painful, and I'm very impressed that you'll be doing that, and it's a very good cause, so thank you for sharing. We have had our first question come in.
Yes.
I have only 1.5 years of lease left, and being in the tail end of the lease has its own challenges, which my landlord agrees, but they are offering relocation as well as downsizing of my store along with rent relief. But I really want to negotiate early termination on lease. How likely is this to be mutually negotiated?
It sounds like a good situation, the starting of a good situation if the landlord completely comes to the party. You can certainly negotiate the early surrender of your lease and time that with entering into a new lease under a relocation and downsize. So I'm not 100% sure of the circumstances of that, whether they're invoking a relocation clause because of a development or whatever, and there's some timing around that. But if they're simply willing to try to look after you and put you into a smaller tenancy, which would help with the total rent and so on, so it's more a restructure for your benefit and obviously their benefit longer term, then the timing of that could be negotiated, and you could come out of that quite well. They're the sort of situations we certainly like to take up for our clients. It does provide a good opportunity to get a very good result earlier in the term, and now is probably a really good time to be negotiating the rent on that new premises as well. So I would think what you were trying to achieve could certainly be achieved, but we would need to review a fair bit more detail to give specific guidance and advice on that.
Thank you, Kyle. Our next question is from Kelly. My landlord is asking for verified sales figures. What does that mean? I'm unwilling to provide more information than I need to.
Yeah, look, it's almost every single case landlords are asking for ridiculous amounts of what I consider confidential information for retailers. Everything from, and we've covered this in previous weeks, so sorry for repeating, but it's still happening. Tax returns, BAS statements, P&Ls, and numerous other things. In all honesty, none of that is required under the code. The code simply states sufficient and accurate information as provided by like a point of sale software, an accounting software program, or a financial institution. The code is very clear that it's measuring turnover and the impact of COVID-19 on your turnover. It's not It also says that as soon as you achieve eligibility for the JobKeeper program, once you're approved for the JobKeeper program, then under the code you're automatically considered in financial distress. So you don't need to prove to a landlord that you're under financial distress. You simply have to advise them that you are an eligible tenant. You are considered by the JobKeeper program to be a tenant under financial distress. And what the landlord is required to do is to provide you with proportional rent relief based on your turnover. So the only figures you really need to give them is turnover figures. We've created a very basic spreadsheet that I showed you last week that provides monthly turnover figures for the last 12 months and for this year on a monthly basis for direct comparison and the impact. That there's really no reason they should receive anything else. I know they are, and I know they've been quite strong on that. It's up to you personally whether you want to resist that or go along with it. But my issue with that is that in 12 months or 24 months or 6 months, you may be negotiating with this landlord on rent, and I really don't want them to have seen your BAS statements, your tax statements, your P&Ls to understand exactly how much you can afford. I want the rent to be negotiated based on market conditions, not on your ability to pay rent. So I would be sticking to in the Code of Conduct there's a definition 2, and I'd be citing that, and I'd be citing the fact that it also says that once you're eligible for the JobKeeper, you're automatically considered under financial distress, and that's all you need to show.
Thanks, Kyle. It's really concerning that this is still cropping up, unfortunately. Yeah, just to also let all of our listeners know, we have got these resources and our roadmap to retail recovery on the NRA coronavirus.net.au website, which should answer some of your questions and hopefully help. So our next question is, if you are a landlord whose tenant has decided to close due to downturn in sales, can you claim any rent for the period they self-decided to close? Or does the code mean a 100% waiver of the rent for the closure period and perhaps extend the lease by the same period as the 100% waived period?
Okay, there's multiple points there, so let me try to pick them up. From a landlord's perspective, and the landlords have rights here as well. Remember, you've got to think of them as your retail partner, not your adversary. So coming at this from a landlord, there's store closures, there's 2 components. Was it a mandated government closure? In that case, automatically it should be 100%. If they closed for very valid reasons, duty of care, safety, complete lack of foot traffic, then that's a negotiation between, but it wasn't a mandated government by the mandated by the government that they had to close. That's a conversation between the two. But I certainly am pushing for our clients that includes a 100% rent relief. In those situations, stores absolutely had the right to close if they were impacted to that degree that it wasn't financially viable, or they couldn't provide duty of care, safe working conditions to their employees. So I don't have any problem at all with tenants seeking or being granted 100% rent relief in that period. There were a couple of other points to this spec that I can't remember. One of them, I think, was about extending that period.
Extend the lease by the same period as the 100% lease.
The only reason you would do that is, and certainly our recommendation to tenants is try to avoid extending your lease, unfortunately, for landlords. But the only reason the lease should be extended is if it expires within the minimum 24-month period for repayment of any deferred rent. That's the only real reason. Of course, if the 2 parties want to negotiate and as a trade-off for getting 100% rent relief waived, a landlord asks the tenant to extend their lease by that same period, and the tenant's willing to do that, then that's a good outcome. So it comes back to in good faith discussions between the parties. It doesn't have to be the bare minimum or only what's mandated under the code.
Thank you. Mark has asked, do you agree that there will be a shift in leasing towards more percentage of turnover-based rents? Are you seeing landlord acceptance of this fundamental change or resistance?
Resistance, definitely. Landlords don't want to share in the upside at the risk of earning less. They want certainty around their rents. So absolute resistance. There's very few landlords have been interested in discussing turnover rents so far. So I don't see a big shift to that. It should. From a tenant's perspective, it makes sense. From the relationship and the best way, fairest way, I think, for tenants to get through the recovery period is to share the burden with the landlord by paying a turnover rent. There's some burden on the landlord to get foot traffic back to the stores, back to the shopping centres, and I think turnover rent should be the way forward, but I'm not seeing that being widely accepted by landlords, and understand where they're resisting entering into those agreements either during the recovery period or as new lease terms after that. I think the big driver of rent turnover percentage-based rents going forward will be Solomon Lew and the Premier Group, with 70% of their leases up for renewal or already in holdover in 2020. They're in a prime position to put incredible pressure on landlords, on the major landlords, to adopt percentage rents, and I know that's how they would want to be doing their leases going forward. So we'll see what happens.
And we've got John, who has asked, do you have any negotiation tips for speeding up negotiations with a landlord?
No. Look, they're frustrating. Probably the best way of speeding it up is holding your ground in terms of rent and what you pay. The code does say that you're obligated to maintain the terms of your lease, but it also says that you should pay whatever rent you're able to pay. So if you are able to pay the proportion of rent equivalent to the impact on your business, if your turnover has been impacted by 80%, it's only fair that you can only afford 20% of your rent. And if you're making that payment in the interim while the landlord is in negotiations, then they can go as slow as they want, really, because you're paying the rent that the final outcome should be based on anyway. So that's the only way that we have any real leverage to get to the solution more quickly. Unfortunately, a lot of landlords in a couple of states are choosing not to enter in negotiations right now until the mandatory code of conduct is legislated by regulations giving effect to the code in each state, and that hasn't happened everywhere just yet. Still in process in a couple of places like WA.
Thank you. So we've got a question. Having 6 stores with 6 different landlords, can one of the landlords demand the information on all stores in the group, or can they only request information on the property they are the landlord for?
Yeah, look, the mandatory code of conduct relates to your lease, and you have a lease on one property with one landlord. So really, any other information on other leases is irrelevant. I go back to the point I made before. If you apply for the JobKeeper program, that's as a group, as a company that owns 6 leases, and your combined total income from those 6 businesses is less than $50 million. So the only thing I would concede is that you may well have to provide last year's tax statement or BAS statement showing that your group as a whole of 6 stores earned less than $50 million. But the impact of COVID is on the lease that you're negotiating with that landlord. So it's irrelevant whether all 6 stores are impacted or not. That lease entity on that side has been impacted by a certain percentage, and that's what the negotiation should be based on.
Thank you. We've got Kelly who's asking, where can we get a copy of the Rent Code of Conduct?
Our Lpc Cresa website has a resource page that has all legislation from every state in one folder. It has the actual code of conduct in a separate folder. Very easy to find. If you go to our website on the landing page, you'll see a COVID-19 section and click on that. There's a button at the top of the landing page, how we help. And if you go down to resources, click on resources, and you'll see 3 folders. One has the link to all of these webinars. Beck and the NRA are good enough to let us post them on our own website for people to view. One folder has all the legislation from every state around COVID, and the third folder has the actual code of conduct document from the National Cabinet.
Thank you very much. And our final question comes from Clovis. I have a question about reporting the turnover rent and if you can exclude the delivery fee charged by delivery providers. Legislation says you can exclude delivery fees, but the delivery companies call it a service fee that provides delivery.
Technicalities. Look, the definition of gross sales is there to there is a portion in there that allows you to deduct delivery charges. I consider that charges associated with delivery. They're charges that you wouldn't be charged if you weren't delivering that product. So I would certainly justify excluding any costs and charges and fees associated with delivering a product. One of my clients, hopefully they don't mind me mentioning, Baskin Robbins, were forced to go to delivery only. That business worked pretty hard to improve its home delivery offering when that happened on March 23rd. And certainly we're excluding all the costs associated with delivering the product, so that the cost being applied to gross sales is the transaction cost of the actual product, not Uber Eats' charges or the fees associated with that delivery. It's exactly the same with news agents who sell lottery tickets. If you sell a lottery ticket for $20, the news agent doesn't get $20. They give $18 to the lotto, and they earn $2 commission. So it's the commission amount that they include in gross sales. So if you could think of it that way, you should be able to exclude all of those fees and charges justifiably under gross sales.
Okay, great. Well, that is all of our questions for today. Thank you very much, Kyle, for your time again this beautiful wintry Wednesday. And I'm sure we're all going to be thinking of you and what you'll be enduring on Saturday in the interests of the MND and Me Foundation.
Thank you. If anyone rides a bike and knows Swift, jump online and look for me on Saturday morning. You can come and keep me company from about 4 a.m. until midday or a little after.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to everyone attending, and we'll see you all next week.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.